One of the most notorious kings to reign over England was King Richard III. He's been portrayed throughout the centuries as a man who murdered his nephews so he could take the throne himself in a huge power grab during the Wars of the Roses. Richard's reign did not last long, as within 2 years of his crowning he would be lying dead on the battlefield, being slaughtered by the forces of his enemy, Henry Tudor. Richard's story has been one which has been muddled with legend. However, the true facts about his brutal death were uncovered when his remains were discovered under a car park in Leicester in 2013. But what is showed the world was that the last Plantagenet King of England died a horrifically barbaric death on the battlefield, and he suffered a number of earth-shattering wounds, particularly one which was fatal on the back of his skull. But what happened when the grave was opened and when the king's bones were discovered? Richard III was crowned king on the 6th of July 1483 inside of Westminster Abbey, and the Wars of the Roses had for decades gripped England. He was a king who had publicly denounced the princes in the Tower, his nephews, of whom one, King Edward V, was the rightful king of England. The two boys, Edward V and his brother Richard, were held inside the Tower of London, awaiting their coronation, when they disappeared, and many believed that Richard III, who seized the throne, was responsible for their murder and disappearance. However, Henry VII, or Henry Tudor as he was known, met Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August of 1485, and this would be considered the last, if not one of the final battles of the Wars of the Roses, the English Civil War that had gripped the nation for decades, fought between the House of York and Lancaster. Richard had a much larger army, and facing him was Henry Tudor's forces, but also watching the proceedings was Lord Stanley, who led 6,000 men and mercenary soldiers who would later become the pivotal part of the battle. His support would change the tides of English history forever, and he would turn on his support for Richard III and support his stepson, Henry Tudor, and his forces waded in at the final part of the battle. It was claimed in the final minutes of the battle that Richard III fought in the thickest presses of his enemies, and that he in fact met a very brave demise in death. The king's men could smell victory, and they wanted to bring the battle to a close, and death with Henry Tudor himself. The king and a number of his men rode bravely towards Henry Tudor, who was being guarded by some bodyguards, and Richard, being a skilled military commander, smashed his way through the guards of Henry Tudor, and he personally killed the Tudor standard-bearer. He was fighting hand to hand, but at some point, whilst he was in boggy, marshy ground, Richard III was unhorsed and he came stuck. He had allegedly come within a sword's length of Henry Tudor, his enemy, but Richard found himself then overwhelmed by Lord Stanley's forces and soldiers. His horse had got stuck in the muddy terrain, and it was claimed that Richard was struggling in the mud and that the death blow was struck by a Welshman with a halberd whilst Richard's horse was stuck, and it was said that the blow was so violent that the king's helmet was driven into his skull. It was alleged that specifically the man who killed Richard III was a Welshman called Rhys ap Thomas, who even shaved part of the king's skull when he struck him hard with his weapon. It was claimed that Richard fought very bravely, and it was also said that he fell in the field struck by many mortal wounds, and that they beat his head until his brains came out with blood, and they never left him until he was dead. Following this, the body of Richard III was stripped naked and was then paraded throughout the streets to Leicester, where it was placed on display for a number of days. For Henry VII, as he was now known, it was important for Richard's body to be seen, as the people of England needed to get the message about his death. But following the display of the dead king's remains, Richard's body was hastily buried inside the priory of the Great Friars inside of Leicester. In 1495, Henry VII commissioned an alabaster memorial to mark the site of Richard's burial, but the abbey was then demolished during the dissolution of the monasteries. There were many debates as to what happened to the remains of Richard III, including a very strong rumour, even told to me as a child, that his remains were thrown into the River Soar in Leicester. There were even plaques created around the city marking where it was believed his remains were thrown in the river off the bridges. However, this was not true. In 2013, one of the discoveries of the century was made, as the former site of the Grey Friars was located in the car park of a Leicester council building, and then remarkably, a skeleton was found with battle wounds on it. Eventually, this skeleton was confirmed via DNA to have been that of King Richard III, over 500 years after his death. But the discovery of his body showed a barbaric and brutal death that the king suffered on the battlefield, and the true account of his death could be pieced together. Richard suffered 11 wounds on his skeleton, and 8 of these were to his skull. These had been sustained in the battle, and it alluded to the fact that the king lost his helmet during the last parts of the battle, and with this an attack was launched towards the king. There was more than one person using different weaponry that attacked Richard, and he also suffered a V-shaped cut along the bottom right part of his lower jaw, and his face was also cut by a knife or a dagger. Another cut on his lower jaw had also been made. But the body of Richard III was well protected, leading to the conclusion that he was wearing significant armour, which was effective, and he had little injury to his torso, meaning he was still wearing his armour when he was killed. There was another wound on the left above his ear and on top of his skull, but the wound that was fatal was brutal. 3 glancing blows caused by a sharp-bladed weapon, such as a sword, also caused further misery. But there was also a small piercing hole in the king's skull caused by a roundel dagger being driven into his skull, and this could have caused brain damage. The fatal wound was at the base of the skull, and this was a huge wound that showed a very powerful weapon, such as a bill or a halberd that struck Richard III at the side of his head and had smashed through the top of his vertebrae, shattering his neck. This had even sliced through his brain, and this would have been a wound that would have stopped anyone in their tracks, and he would never have recovered from this. It is likely that this could have killed Richard III instantly, and this is corroborated in the sources as being the wound inflicted by the Welshman with his halberd. Because of this allowed the historians to tell the story of the final moments of King Richard III's life over 500 years ago. Richard must have been in trouble following being unhorsed and stuck in the mud, and he then may have lost his helmet or have taken it off in an attempt to dive towards his enemy. He was thought left very vulnerable, and his enemies then jumped on him, and he was surrounded by the best armed medieval soldiers who were skilled with their weapons. His own men tried their best to fight for him and defend him, but Lord Stanley's forces waded in and overwhelmed Richard III and inflicted many different wounds upon him. But then the crushing blow from the halberd came, stopping the kin there and then killing him and bringing the Plantagenet dynasty to an end. Following the end of the battle, the king's face was not heavily disfigured further, so that his body could be identified, and so the people in Leicester could see that their king was dead. Richard III was buried inside of a plain coffin, and over the centuries this had decayed, and the coffin was not found when Richard's body was, meaning that it had just left Richard's skeletal remains in the ground. But what the death of Richard III brought was the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, a ruling family who would for the next century change the face of England forever. We consider Henry VII's defeat of Richard III as something that stabilised England following the Wars of the Roses. However, his dynasty would bring the execution of queens, thousands of people across the land, and a huge amount of religious turmoil. Thank you for watching, and as a support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.